Hello everybody, welcome back to Book of Kings, where we discuss topics such as history, religion, philosophy, psychology, culture, and more, and the way that they all interact with one another. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to receive a notification every time I release a new video. Hope you enjoy. In 1989, at the time of the impending end of the Cold War, political scientist Francis Fukuyama wrote an article entitled The End of History, which he would turn into a full-length book in 1992 after the eventual fall of the Soviet Union. In it, he proposed that with the end of the Cold War and the victory of the West, liberal democracy had prevailed over its two primary 20th century competitors, Marxism-Leninism, or communism, and fascism, which had been defeated during World War II. And with that, the world had arrived at the quote-unquote end of history. Borrowing the term from the 19th century philosopher George Hegel, Fukuyama postulated that humanity had arrived at its final stage of social-political development, with liberal democracy being the final social-political system of humanity, with no new ideologies or political systems going on to pose a significant challenge to it. This would result in the establishment of a quote-unquote universal homogeneous state, or global civilization, where politics would retreat from the forefront of social affairs, being replaced by economics and a global consumer culture, with no further notable conflicts occurring between major world powers, aside from more minor conflicts potentially continuing to occur between nations still, quote-unquote, stuck in history. Fukuyama's former teacher, fellow political scientist Samuel Huntington, had a different take on the post-Cold War world. In his 1993 article entitled Clash of Civilizations, which he would expand into a full-length book in 1996, Huntington would assert that while the 20th century had been dominated by conflict between ideologies originating from the West, namely liberal democracy, Marxism-Leninism, and fascism, with the end of the Cold War and liberal democracy prevailing over the ideologies which had challenged it, ideology would no longer be at the forefront of geopolitics, but rather the native cultures and religions of the world would re-emerge and rise to the surface of global affairs. He would emphasize that the end of the Cold War and the expansion of economic development around the globe did not signify one world civilization, but rather economic and technological advancement signified modernization, but not necessarily westernization. Nations would work to develop economic and military power while still preserving their native cultures in order to quote-unquote modernize but not westernize. Influence would no longer be unidirectional, flowing from the West to the non-Western world, but rather it would be multidirectional, with the various civilizations of the world mutually influencing one another. As he put it, global politics had become multipolar and multi-civilizational. Huntington would propose various primary civilizations within the world, those being Western civilization, based upon Western Christianity, that is Protestantism and Catholicism, and European culture, Islamic civilization, of course based upon the Islamic faith, Sinic or Confucian civilization, based upon Chinese culture and Confucian social norms, Hindu civilization, based upon the Hindu religion and Indian culture, Orthodox civilization, based upon Orthodox Christianity and in large part Slavic culture, Latin American civilization, based upon the Spanish and Portuguese languages, as well as being primarily Catholic, African civilization, which could potentially be united based upon a growing Pan-African identity, Buddhist civilization, constituting Buddhist majority nations. Interestingly, Huntington would describe Japan as its own unique civilization, distinct from Sinic/Confucian civilization. This distinct categorization may have been assigned in light of Japan's position as an economic powerhouse during the 80s and 90s, with a unique position of being connected to yet separate from the West. Conflict in the world would now be between different civilizations, which Huntington presented as forming their own distinct geopolitical blocks. Nation-states would still remain the primary unit in world affairs. However, wars and ethnic conflicts would primarily be between nations from different civilizations, as opposed to states possessing different political ideologies. Huntington cited examples from the early mid-90s of conflict between nations of different civilizations, one notable example being the conflict in Yugoslavia between the Orthodox Serbs, Muslim Bosnians, and Catholic Croatians. Huntington noted the differences in how nations of the world reacted to the events which occurred during the conflict with respect to groups which were part of their own civilization and those which were not. He noted how the Western world, while expressing horror at the crimes committed by the Serbs, largely ignored crimes committed by the Catholic Croats and provided arms to Croatia. How Russia demonstrated restraint in condemning the atrocities committed by fellow Orthodox Serbs, and how Muslim nations expressed outrage at the initial lack of action by the West to defend the Bosnians, as well as military aid sent by Muslim nations to Bosnians. Huntington also cited the example of the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, whereby Russia would show support to fellow Orthodox Armenia, while noting that Turkey and Iran would show support to fellow Muslim Azerbaijan. Huntington would also describe quote-unquote torn nations, that is, countries that are fairly culturally homogeneous, but are torn between whether their nation would belong to one civilization or another. One notable example described by Huntington was Turkey, which he described as being torn between Islamic civilization and Western civilization. Another example of a torn nation provided by Huntington was Russia, which was at a turning point following the fall of the Soviet Union, where it was torn between embracing its orthodox roots after the veil of communism had been lifted, or joining its victorious former Cold War adversaries as a part of Western civilization. Aside from the so-called torn countries, Huntington described blocks of nations which may possibly transition to being a part of Western civilization fairly easily, namely referencing Eastern European nations which had formerly been a part of the Soviet bloc, with him presumably referencing non-Orthodox majority Christian nations such as Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Slovenia. He also described Latin America as having the potential to easily transition to becoming a part of the West, presumably due to the prevalence of Catholicism and cultural and linguistic ties to Spain and Portugal. With the turn of events that the post-Cold War world has taken, some may point to recent events as confirming Huntington's theory, namely the War on Terror, which from the perspective of his Clash of Civilizations theory would have pitted Western civilization and Islamic civilization against one another. In fact, following the attacks of September 11th, political commentator Fareed Zakaria would publish an article aptly titled The End of History, referencing the aforementioned article and book by Francis Fukuyama. More recent events could be viewed from the perspective of Huntington's theory, namely the growing divide between the West and Russia and China, who have increasingly aligned in opposition to the West. Huntington proposed a potential geopolitical alignment of the quote-unquote West versus the rest, which, as the name implies, pits Western civilization against the other civilizations of the world. With China nominally under communist rule and Russia under Vladimir Putin's conservative nationalist leadership, this would seemingly place them at opposite ends of the political spectrum. And with the addition of Iran to the equation, Huntington's prediction of a potential West versus the rest could potentially be said to explain such a political alignment, despite the contradiction of such a relationship from an ideological perspective. With regard to Huntington's categorization of Russia in the 90s as a quote-unquote torn nation, which could potentially become a part of either Western civilization or Eastern Orthodox civilization, the rise of Putinist Russia would seem to confirm that Russia ultimately pivoted toward being an Orthodox nation rather than being a Western nation. In fact, with the current war in Ukraine, it can be argued, as many have done, that Ukraine is now the torn nation, being pulled between Western and Orthodox civilizations. It should be noted that Huntington did describe Ukraine as a quote-unquote cleft country, that is a country having large groups of people of different civilizations, referencing the sizable Catholic population in western Ukraine and the Orthodox majority as one goes further east. All of this, coupled with the growing calls for a multipolar world order, in opposition to the unipolar, Western-dominated order which has dominated global affairs since the end of the Cold War, may be argued to confirm Huntington's theory of a geopolitical clash of civilizations. On the other hand, critics of Huntington's theory would criticize it as being overly reductionistic and unnuanced, forcing the nations of the world into cookie-cutter categories, failing to take into consideration the overlap and mutual exchange of ideas between cultures, focusing on the differences between the various cultures of the world as opposed to the common features that unite them. But what do you think? Are we living in a clash of civilizations, or is this too simplistic? Do we have one global cosmopolitan civilization, or universal homogeneous state? Have we reached the end of history? Or are we witnessing the beginning of a multipolar world with the different civilizations of the world pivoting to their respective camps while simultaneously influencing one another? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. Thank you for watching. This has been another Book of Kings video. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to receive a notification every time I release a new video.